Welcome to Absolutely Not, the live podcast series dedicated to providing examples of setting personal boundaries at work and the vocabulary needed to name harm in those spaces. I want everyone and anyone to set personal boundaries at work and create healthy relationships in the places that they want to be in. Today's episode is titled, Sis, It's Not You, It's Your Boundaries. I feel that immensely. Oh my goodness. And I'm so glad that our special guest brought that energy to the room today. My special guest today is Cassandra Rowe, LPC-S, the boundaries therapist. I mean, we're going to get into it, but let me read this bio real quick. Cassandra holds a bachelor's degree from Texas Wesleyan University in social science and a master's degree from Amberton University in professional counseling. Yes, she's a licensed professional counselor and a clinical supervisor. Cassandra has worked as a student support counselor, crisis counselor for Mansfield Independent School District since 2006, and she's the owner of Epiphany Counseling Services, LLC in Arlington, Texas. Her clients have affectionately nicknamed her the Boundaries Therapist. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited about this specifically because the title speaks to me on some levels. Where did that title come from?
Well, I can tell you, I probably say that several times a week. You know, clients will come in and they will describe a scenario where they are struggling. And I find myself repeating that like, sis, it's not you, it's your boundaries. And so that just seemed like a perfect title for today's podcast.
I love it. I love it. And the word that you just used was struggling. Okay. And we use that word often to kind of talk about other things that are happening in the workplace. When they say they're struggling, what do they actually mean?
It means they don't know what to do. So they have identified that something is awry or that there is some sort of issue. But a lot of times, boundaries is the last thing that they think is the problem. And so I find that often that, we don't really know the different types of boundaries. We don't really know how to implement them. And that comes from a variety of things, from our own guilt, the way we grew up, our perception of what boundaries do and what they don't do. So a lot of that comes in when people are struggling with a relationship challenge, whether it's their boss or their, significant other, family members. It's usually boundaries.
I love that relationship challenge because we're still in the relationship, but we're having a challenge. What you talked about what boundaries do. What do boundaries do in the midst of that challenge?
Okay. So the whole purpose of boundaries is to set kind of the rules of engagement in our relationship. So boundaries will be able to verbalize or role model to others what we will and will not accept in said relationship. So because boundaries kind of identify those rules, boundaries keep us safe. They keep us emotionally safe. They keep us physically safe. And so in every relationship, healthy boundaries are needed.
In every relationship, healthy. She didn't say some. She didn't say personal relationships. She didn't say professional. She said all of them. My goodness. And what happens when we don't have those boundaries?
Well, we love to say, stay in your lane. That's really a boundary quote because boundaries help us identify our lane. And so you can tell when a boundary is needed is because there's a lot of chaos or conflict. So if you find yourself constantly in someone else's lane or other people constantly in yours, it's because a boundary hasn't been implemented.
It's because of that. And I'm very visual. So I immediately, the highway or dividers, people are going that way. I'm going this way. Imagine if the dividers weren't there.
Exactly. And that's what boundaries do for us. I have a quote that I use that says boundaries save lives. And that quote is in the middle of a highway. because just like those lines and those barriers keep down chaos and they save our life on the freeway, boundaries will save your lives in real life.
Oh my goodness. And she means it. And I mean it as well.
Yes.
I appreciate you bringing that level to boundaries, because I think we talk about it so much as like kind of a concept, but it's a necessity. Quite honestly.
It is.
At what point in your career or your life did you realize this is a necessity?
Sis. You know, for me as a clinician, the professional boundaries were a little bit easier. Okay. Because as a therapist, you can't help but learn what you teach. And so I started my career working with people, with juveniles who had sexual behavior problems. And so boundaries is all up in that. And so I learned a lot about boundaries working with that population. But the hardest place for me personally to set boundaries is with my family, with people that I really have a close relationship to. So the workplace wasn't as hard because I, taught people to do that in their relationships for a living, but it tends to be a little bit harder the more intimate the relationship.
The more intimate the relationship. So for a lot of us, or for a lot of my clients and people that listen to the show, they think it's really hard to set boundaries at work. But could you kind of talk about why it's difficult, or where does that difficulty come from? If you can't even do it at work, where does that difficulty come from?
Right. Well, I think part of it comes because we all want to perform well. And so it starts with our perception of boundaries. So most people think they think of boundaries as a wall. And so boundaries keep other people away, when in fact, it's the very opposite. Because people are clear about what works for you, what doesn't work for you, how you can show up your best self, and what things are barriers to you showing up your best self, you end up being closer. The relationships end up being healthier. So I think the main reason people fear setting boundaries at work are, one, they fear that there will be some consequence, or that they won't be seen as a team player, or somehow this is going to show up on your performance evaluation, when in fact, once you get through those hard conversations, it really helps people get to know you.
Oh, it really helps people to get to know you. And I think a lot of us go into workplaces or relationships in the workplace thinking this is what it's supposed to be. We already have like a mindset, like this is what this relationship looks like. But you use two words to kind of define relationships. You use close and healthy. Are those synonyms, or are they not alike at all?
Those are separate entities. Those are separate entities. We have a lot of relationships that aren't healthy. I'll say that again. We engage in a lot of relationships that aren't healthy. And sometimes I will say that the responsibility is never on one person, because relationships are two-way streets. So sometimes we've done all we can do. We've done our part in trying to move that relationship towards a healthy level, and it just doesn't happen. So we have to learn to cope in those type of relationships, or in that relationship, whichever, choice that we come to. But you can have a relationship that's unhealthy.
And I always think about my natural hair. Like sometimes it's really long, sometimes it gets long, but I still have to cut it because it's not healthy. It's getting damaged, and I would have to do conditioner and all of that. So just because you have been at that company for a really long time, or been in those relationships for a really long time, does not mean it's healthy. Oh Lord.
No, ma'am. It does not. And a lot of people suffer unnecessarily. It's always unnecessary, but they suffer for longer than they need to from burnout. And that comes from those really kind of toxic workplace relationships where they feel helpless. And so as a clinician, I tell my clients all the time, if you're feeling helpless, or that, you don't have a choice in a situation, that's probably your anxiety talking, because we always have a choice. Now, the choices may not be a trip to Disneyland, but we always have a choice. And so really spending some time thinking about our choices can help kind of reduce that anxiety and that fear that, if I make a change, then it's going to be catastrophic, because it usually isn't.
And if you have data to kind of back that emotion, like if you have seen the catastrophe happen there before, after they set boundaries, then that's an indicator, and it's there's nothing else you can do.
It's dead, girl. Let it go.
Well, you talked about that two-way street.
Yes.
So when someone sets boundaries at work, what does the person on the other side of the street, or what would it look like in a healthy relationship?
Right. Well, it depends, because you are examining different factors. So how healthy the other person's personal boundaries are. Do they understand what boundaries are? And then also the system, because what I find in workplaces, a lot of times the system doesn't support a healthy boundaries. It's not necessarily an individual in the system. Sometimes it's the system. So, one of the things that I know is that sometimes when you set boundaries, it feels really rigid and restrictive to the other person if no one has ever set boundaries in that area. So it's kind of foreign, And so just because it's uncomfortable doesn't mean that it's bad.
That is the second time I have heard this week. I don't know if the universe is trying to tell me something, but leave me alone. I have stuff to do. I really appreciate you breaking it down, because even before you get into that organization, you need to have that conversation. Do y'all know what boundaries looks like? Do you know what boundaries looks like from somebody with mental health conditions? Do you know what boundaries looks like from a Black woman?
Hey, that part right there. And, I think that traditionally, historically, that when we as Black women try to assert our boundaries, that develops a kind of a negative perception of us. And so, what I like to remind my clients who are people of color is that boundaries can be both verbalized and role modeled. So, I know I have been in workplaces where my verbalization of the boundary wasn't accepted, but the role modeling of it was. And I'll give you an example. So, for example, if I'm at lunch, so one of the things that I do, girl, is I take a lunch, honey. That's called self-care. And you can't practice self-care if you don't have good boundaries. So I'm going to say that again for the people in the back. Setting healthy boundaries is the ultimate form of self-care, because it gives you the space to do it.
Oh, my heart. Okay. The space. Okay.
The space. So, I take a lunch. If I am in the middle of something, or if there's a meeting or something, I may not always take a lunch at the same time. So I've had to teach the people that I work with that when I am at lunch, either indicated by my door is closed and there's a sign that says I'm at lunch, or if I am sitting, in the lunch area, that time is off limits. I'm not taking phone calls. Somebody better be bleeding before you come and interrupt that. Okay. And so I have not had to say that. But what happens is when someone interrupts that time, I redirect. So I've had, people say, oh, well, so-and-so is on the phone. Okay, please let them know that I'm at lunch and I'll be out at 1 and I'll give them a call back then. See, I didn't have to say that's a boundary violation. I redirected it. And so what I just taught them was that during lunch, I don't take phone calls.
And you know what? One of my biggest boundaries is I don't provide on-the-spot education around anything that I do for work. But that type of on-the-spot education, if you will, if I put it in the same category, is self-care. It is for me. It's not for
Yes.
you to learn more. It's to protect me and to keep me safe.
Exactly. So you're already doing that. And that's what I said. So you just said, when I said earlier, it's not as hard for me at work. That's the same example you gave. I don't give on the spot, recommendations or advice, to people about my work. That's a boundary that you've set.
Ooh.
You out here setting boundaries and didn't even know it, girl. Go ahead.
And even when you said, that's not something I do here, or this is my lunch, the language, a lot of Black women in particular, we have been setting boundaries for a really long time, but we did not have the language or the label. Right. So when people receive the messages, the boundaries that we're putting out there, they're defining it as otherwise. Have you ever had that occur to you?
I do a boundaries boot camp, and one of the things that I teach people is how to say no. And that sounds so simple, but in the moment, it's helpful to have some phrases that you can use other than no, period. So one of the things that we talk about are there's some ways that you can say no that don't just sound like nope. So I'm not available right now, but I'll be available at this time. Okay. That really doesn't work in my schedule today. Let's look at when I will be available for that. I've decided to change my mind. That's a big one, because a lot of times we hold ourselves to, a lot of times we say yes to things we should have said no to. And then when we think about it, we're like, you know what? I don't have the time or the resources or the space, or maybe I just don't want to do it. And so it is okay to change your mind and come back and say, you know what? After further thought, I don't think I'm going to be able to accommodate that right now. So I'm going to have to change my mind and decline. We have a right to do that. So to have the language in order to say no really makes it helps you feel more comfortable in saying no. I say a lot of times, so my sister is so funny. She works in HR. And so she uses a term called, it's a hard no. That's a hard no. So I was like, well, what's a soft no? What's a soft no? So, but I like that because, she is explaining that there are some no's for me that I may think about and get back to you. And then there's some things that I don't really need to think about anymore. That's just a hard no.
Oh my gosh. And it's levels to it. The boundaries are fluid in any situation with other people. When you talked about taking back your space, if you have already engaged with somebody or have already promised to do something, I thought about the messages we get as children, kind of like, well, that's your word is your bond, or you made a promise to that person, you need to keep it. How can we work to kind of unlearn that?
Well, I believe in reparenting yourself. So that's one of the things that I do in therapy. Many of our parents didn't have the tools, so they couldn't give us the tools. And so what I want people to know is that the tools are out there. And when you become an adult, it becomes your responsibility to find those tools. So a lot of our, early adulthood is relearning what the world means to us and not necessarily what the world meant to our parents. And so some of that is the same, but a lot of it is different. And so we call those cognitive distortions, the shoulds or the haves. I have to do this because I gave my word. Like my grandmother used to say, you ain't got to do nothing but stay Black and die. And so that's a real situation right there, because those are the only two absolutes. Really, those are the only two absolutes. There may be some consequences of changing your mind. For example, if you've committed to something and there are financial, obligations, you may lose money. Okay. But if you know that you are not able to show up as your 100% self, then the lesser of the consequences may be just to eat that cost.
Because you're eating it somewhere else. Like somewhere else is gonna take a bite.
Because if you don't show up your 100% self and someone else sees you, how is that going to impact your professional reputation? So it's really about weighing the cost. A lot of times we allow others to weigh the cost for us. We need to weigh the cost for ourselves and decide what can I live with?
We allow others to weigh the cost for us. And sometimes those others, I recently with a special guest, they said they used to use the word they a lot. And one day somebody asked them, who is they? Is it oh, okay. But beyond that, you mentioned the tools out there that we need to be researching and using to be ordered to set these healthy boundaries in the relationships we are part of. Are there any softwares or affirmations or exercises that you have used personally to set healthier boundaries in your life?
Right. Well, I will say that, social media is just a wealth of information. If you just put in boundaries in IG, a million hits are going to come up. So, many of us are on social media anyway. So, that's a great place to start. There are lots of books out on boundaries. Everyone has something to say about boundaries. Let me say that. Every clinician has something to say about boundaries. So what I would say to you is, I like Dr. Henry Cloud. He is a boundaries guru. And so his information on boundaries, he has several books that are out. So I really like his work because he makes it plain. A lot of times when we talk about a subject like boundaries, is very vague and ambiguous. And so I like information that I can take and apply as soon as I hear it. And so definitely look at Dr. Cloud's work, and also lots of therapists are on Instagram. I'm on Instagram, epiphanycounselingtexas.com. I follow lots of other therapists who are doing great work. And then also seeking therapy. I think people think therapy is only when you have a major trauma. Therapy is also just for personal growth.
Exactly. And this is a journey. I talk about this often, that implementing boundaries, setting boundaries, you're going to need professional help to continue this journey regardless. Like your car needs gas, it needs a tune-up, so you might as well find somebody that you can at least keep in your back pocket, or a book that you can keep in your back pocket.
This is true. And you talked about affirmation. So one of the biggest affirmations for me is that I set boundaries for me and not necessarily for you. And so what that means for me is that my boundaries don't have anything to do with you. This is what works for me. And I understand that you may not agree with it. I think that, trips people up a lot. Like, well, they don't agree with my boundaries. Well, your boundaries are yours. So they don't have to agree with them, but it's helpful for them to honor them, because that makes our relationship less chaotic.
And that's what we're trying to do. I'm not trying to harm you. I'm not trying to end the relationship. I'm not trying to do none of that shit. I'm trying to continue a healthy relationship with you, but I want to feel safe in it.
Yeah.
I tell you what. Okay. But have you ever had a discussion with someone, set a healthy boundary, and it go less than positive?
Oh yeah, all the time. All the time. And that's why what I meant by earlier is most of the time, if you set a boundary with someone and it goes left, it's because that person is no longer able to manipulate or get what they want from you. So you set a limit on what I'm willing to give, right? So if it goes left, that's because that person wants what they want. It's not necessarily that your boundary was wrong.
That last part, really, that person wants what they want. And immediately I finished the sentence myself and I said, more than they want you.
They want the relationship.
Yes. And I just,
Mm-hmm.
for anybody out there that's like, oh no, this keeps happening. Like I keep saying boundaries with people and honey or sir or man or
Sis.
yes. There's a reason. There is a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Oh no.
And I have a saying that if you're feeling burnout or frustrated or aggravated or overwhelmed in any relationship, then a boundary is probably needed because you're working harder than the other person. There, the power equation is lopsided.
Ooh.
Because that is a sign. Our body and our mind and our psyche tells us what we need. We don't always listen to it. So if you're feeling, some kind of way about, whether, you should be doing this in a relationship or a person should be talking to you that way, that's kind of your spidey senses telling you, no, they shouldn't. And so a boundary is probably needed.
Oh, a boundary is probably, and you said the perfect, you are probably working more than the other person. This ain't a seesaw, or it is a seesaw, and I need you to do your part. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
Because you think about it in relationships like that, it doesn't happen the first time you're doing more than your share, or the second time, or even the third time. Usually it's a history of you doing more than your share. So we know that relationships are give and take. And so there may be a season in your life where you or your significant other may be doing more because of, specific factors during this season. But girl, the whole time y'all been in the relationship, no. That's not healthy. That's not healthy.
Oh my gosh. And if you needed that message today, I hope you got it. I really do hope you got it. And not even in a personal sense, in every relationship. So if at work, your manager asked you to do 7 shifts in a row, and then when you ask for 7 days off, they say no. Oh, the seesaw. Okay. But for the professionals that are listening to your amazing messages today, and they're thinking, okay, I'm going to start doing this. I'm going to start implementing boundaries in any relationship, specifically at work. What would be the top 3 tips you would give for them?
Okay. So I say start early. Okay. A lot of times we get in situations where there have been some boundary crossings, and a boundary crossing usually happens before a full-blown violation, but we don't address it. And so the most important thing for me in helping people learn how to set boundaries is that you got to recognize and identify what the boundary is that's needed. And then you have to verbalize it, and then you have to implement it. And so if someone crosses it again, you re-verbalize it and re-implement it. You don't just say, well, they didn't, honor that boundary. So now I'm not going to continue to work towards, having them honor that. That's not how boundaries work. They don't implement themselves. It's work. You have to implement them. You have to re-verbalize them. You have to sometimes role model them. So that is my first one. Make sure that you do that earlier, sooner rather than later, because if you don't, you just end up feeling frustrated and overwhelmed and unsupported. And that may not be the case. It may be they didn't even know that was a boundary for you. So they can't really honor something that they weren't aware of. The second thing the second tip that I believe is important when you're setting boundaries is really to make sure that you have kind of searched yourself, and not only are you verbalizing your own boundaries and honor but that you're honoring other people's boundaries. So the flip side of boundaries is that if you want other people to accept your no, you got to learn to accept their no without taking it personally. So again, boundaries go both ways. Yeah. We're all for people honoring our boundaries, but sis, do you have some areas in your life where you haven't been honoring other people's boundaries?
And like we said before, this is a whole journey, a whole basket. You can't just take some of it out. You have to do the whole thing. You have to do a lot of work in between yourself, but you have a licensed therapist in front of you right now who is willing to help you. So if you heard this message today and are thinking, damn, I have to get it together and soon, we have some resources for you.
Yes.
Are there any last minute sprinkles you would like to share with the audience?
My last minute sprinkles are this, is that we're all a work in progress. And so, even if you have missed the mark on setting boundaries or honoring other people's boundaries, you can start today. Okay. And so boundaries is the one thing that you can implement in your relationships that will transform your relationships immediately. And so I really, it's one of my favorite things to talk about, one of my favorite things to teach. And it is never too late to start implementing a healthy boundary.
It is never too late. I think a lot of people are waiting for that quick fix, or they're thinking that like, oh, well, I already passed. I'm 40, whatever years old, or I'm this years old. I'm already been with him or her for a really long time. I can't do it. Could you just say that one more time for them?
It is never too late. And let me say this, that your boundaries will change as the season changes. I am in the season of parenting adult children. Y'all pray my strength. Okay. And what I have learned is that I have to have a different set of boundaries now that my children are adults than I had when they were living in my house and they were under my tutelage, as they say back in old school. And so that's a great example of how boundaries will sometimes change as your relationship status changes.
Tell them. And I immediately thought of, at one point I was an employee and then I became a manager. The people who became employees with me, we had to change boundaries. No longer was I going out drinking with them. No longer was I texting them on the regular, because we have changed. I have grown. Ooh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And sometimes it's us. I know for me, and I'm the boundaries therapist, I had to seek guidance. I'll tell you, I got a book called Practicing Healthy Boundaries with Your Adult Children, just so that I would make sure that I was, role modeling healthy boundaries in that relationship. And so we're all a work in progress. I'm a therapist. I go to therapy. Therapy's for everybody, honey, everybody. So if you feel like that's something that would benefit you, I really encourage you to take that next step and find a therapist that can help you, learn how to implement those boundaries in your lives.
And you have an amazing one right in front of you today. So
thank you.
Don't wait. Thank you so much for being here today. I can't thank you enough. For everybody listening out there, continue to do everything that you need to do for us healthier, safer you, and say absolutely not to anything unaligned. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to Absolutely Not. Your support means the world to me. You can always further support the show by leaving a review or visiting the Support the Mission page on my website, www.katrinastrohl.com. My website is also where you can register for upcoming live episodes, watch amazing past episodes of Absolutely Not, and buy Absolutely Not merch. Yay! Until next time, keep setting those boundaries and saying absolutely not to anything unaligned. See you next time.